Hello, this is JFL, John Francis Leader, and welcome to the Body, Mind, Self podcast. So my guest today is Abeba Birhane. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you.
So I've wanted to have you on for a while. We have a shared adventure in the cognitive science program here in University College Dublin. And you, I suppose, are probably a bit hard to define, which is why I'm going to try and let you do that to some degree now in a moment.
Yes.
But that's, I think, what I liked about you and your work is it's touching on some very, very interesting topics that might at first glance seem like separate things, but they actually have a way of meeting and coming together.
Well, I'm only on my first year of my PhD, and I have so much interest in so many different fields. And hopefully the idea is things will kind of come together and, make the dots will somehow make a line, and people things will kind of make sense.
Absolutely. Well, it's certainly, I think, happening to at least some degree already.
Yeah.
Just as a quick side point, that's one of my experiences in UCD is the amazing humility that so many researchers have. If you even think about the sentence, only in the first year of my PhD, isn't it, as a sentence even? That's great. It's a great attitude in so many ways.
Yeah.
But I suppose the life story alone, what to speak of even just the academic research you've done, but the life story alone to get you to this point inevitably has to be so much, to be at a point like this. So how would you introduce yourself to somebody who doesn't know you and your work? Where do you come from? What are you interested in? Who are you?
Okay, that's also a difficult question, but I will try to give a straightforward answer as much as I can.
Sure.
So my academic background is also very interdisciplinary. When I did my undergrad back home in Ethiopia, I started out doing physics.
Oh, yeah.
But after the first year, I just couldn't cope with all the calculus, and mathematics was compulsory. After the first year of my degree, I switched to, you wouldn't guess, to which department? To English.
Oh, wow.
And then I finished my undergrad there. And then I came to Ireland, and I did a psychology degree, and then I moved on to doing philosophy and then cognitive science masters just a couple of years ago. And now I'm doing cognitive science PhD again, and it couldn't get any more interdisciplinary.
Absolutely.
As cognitive science, you have, I'm sure you are aware of it, you have disciplines like psychology, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, philosophy, even anthropology, any discipline that deals with the mind or human behavior, coming together to kind of make sense of why we behave the way we behave and how the mind works.
And if your initial motivation from leaving physics was to make your life easier, did you achieve that goal at all? I'm not sure.
Probably not, but I do somehow regret leaving physics because it comes back to haunt me because I feel like I could do with a lot more mathematical knowledge.
Yeah.
I see a lot of these great programmers.
True. Yeah.
Doing great codes, and I do work with them, but sometimes I wish I could also code as well as them. I do also understand the mathematics behind it.
I feel like that every morning, isn't it? It's amazing, I suppose, the skill sets. If you, I suppose, hide in a corner, isn't it? And by that I mean you have a kind of a topic or an area of interest that you really enclose yourself in. I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, but if you do that, there's some sense in which you might feel a mastery of it because you've defined it in a way that allows that. But when you do what you seem to be doing, and I think it's something I've been trying to do too, and you go truly multidisciplinary, by definition, I suppose, isn't it, the bounds just become so big. It's quite hard to feel that point of completion.
Exactly. But also the brilliant thing about it is you get insights from all sorts of disciplines, from all sorts of people that you work with, and you are constantly at a much more informed position, at an advantaged point of view. For example, at the moment I'm working with some economists, and I have never done anything with economists
Yes,
before,
yeah.
but it's kind of it's brilliant in a way, because I get to, even though I may not add so much to the conversation, it kind of lets me kind of absorb the kind of language and the kind of
Right.
discourse around.
Right.
And I am more aware of the whole general theme now.
And with some of the topics that you have been focusing on, that transition from whatever you were interested in before you started studying physics and
Yeah.
just your childhood interests even, through to that, and then through to some of the subjects that you've moved through and I'm sure brought with you along the way. Has it felt for you that you've been kind of doing the same thing throughout but in different ways, or has it felt like a radical shift from subject to subject? What's it felt like?
A bit of both. In a way, there is a consistent theme, which is the interest and the eagerness to kind of understand what we call the self is.
Yes.
And what human behavior is. So even though I've been jumping from discipline to discipline,
Yeah.
it had at the core of it had that essence that I'm still looking at how we develop a sense of self, and
Right.
how we come to know ourselves, and what different perspectives there are to investigate those issues.
Yeah, because there is, as you say, quite different language, but there seems to be something at core, isn't it, which is quite universal. And the closest, I think, to trying to turn that into a language seems to be something like systems theory or something along those lines.
Yeah.
That it sort of, it allows those relationships to be brought into it, I suppose, a little bit more. So maybe before we jump into some of the depth, how would you overview what some of your interests are at the moment in terms of your research or what you're focusing on?
Okay, another great and difficult question. Yeah, an overview would be, again, this attempt to understand or to see how different disciplines come at the self. So mainly I'm interested in the non-Western or non-Cartesian.
Yes.
I know they are not interchangeable. And Descartes usually gets blamed for everything Western, but let's not go there. Yeah, I'm interested in the different perspectives, the alternative ways of coming at the self.
Yeah.
But also I have interests in other areas, for example, where technological developments meet the social sphere.
Right.
Say, for example, when we do banking or when we are applying for insurance or anything like that, there is usually algorithms that calculate our worthiness. So
And so do you relate those, two broad topic areas?
I'm hoping they will relate
Yeah.
at some stage.
Yeah.
Yes.
I love that, because something I'm a huge fan of is just application, is putting things into practice. And, I completely get, of course, that there are going to be people who, really focus in on the research and, aren't necessarily practitioners in a thing. That's completely fine. That can be an applied thing in its own way. But there's nothing more beautiful, I suppose, than to take great ideas or good research and not leave it on a bookshelf gathering dust or
Exactly.
on a USB key somewhere,
Exactly.
and to take it
Yes.
and do something with it, isn't it? It's so
Yes.
exciting in that way. So
Yeah.
I think that's what I hear when you mention those two topic areas,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
when we start talking about self and its nature, I mean, that's a great topic. It's a fascinating topic, but there's a danger, isn't it? It gets doomed to a philosophy textbook somewhere, which is so unfortunate, because surely self, if there's anything to be said about it, there's something to be said about it in an applied sense, in a day-to-day sense. That would seem to matter.
Yeah. Well, I have to clarify. I'm not really trying to philosophize about the self or trying to define the self, but I'm just looking at the we have such a predominant view of, a Western view of the self
Yes.
here. We don't even you have to try really hard to see outside that framework. So what I'm trying is to kind of bring those different perspectives from Ubuntu African philosophy and from a lot of Eastern philosophy as well.
Wonderful.
So,
and in doing that, is that intuitively, does it come easily? I'm sure it takes a lot of work either way, but does it intuitively come easy, or does it feel like, you know, the crashing together of very different ideas?
Well, sometimes it could be difficult, but sometimes when you have, you know, great worked out concrete examples,
right,
it's just, you can't just refute that. I'll give you an example. Take the solitary confinement, for example.
Okay.
So the original idea of solitary confinement was for prisoners to just lock themselves away, just to talk to God, to cleanse themselves, and to reflect on their sins, and to come out, you know, pure and clean back into society.
Yes. Yeah.
That is very much that idea is underpinned in a very Western conception of the self, that just, you know, you are individual and you don't need others in order to sustain your sense of self.
Yeah.
That you are logical and self-sustaining and self-contained system, which is very problematic. And that solitary confinement example clearly shows how fallacious it is, because if you put prisoners in solitary confinement for long enough, there has been lots of research, they just lose their sense of self, they suffer from insomnia, they lose a sense of time, and their sense of self is completely distorted.
Again, I can see the value in what you just said, which is bringing in a worked out example like that, isn't it? Because, I mean, it shows how it matters, but the kind of the pictures it conjures up, the sense that you're creating, and just using that example, which is an important example, it kind of gives us something to kind of cognitively latch onto, isn't it? In order to manipulate the ideas when they're in the world of pure abstraction. It can be quite hard to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a useful thinking tool as well as a real world issue of importance as well. So let's jump into that a bit more, the question of self, because that certainly seems to be a key theme in your work, in your research. To start off very, very simply, to begin with, what is self? What do people even think it is? I mean, what are some of the popular definitions that you've come across?
The popular definitions seems to be, just, if you are just self-contained, and if you do a lot of, reasoning and logical analysis, about solving certain problems, or if you just look yourself away and do, all sorts of thinking, you will kind of discover your true self. I think that's the kind of idea I'm trying to move away and say, no, look, we are essentially relational. We need others.
Okay.
And we are also embodied. The body plays a really crucial part. Our embodied experience informs our sense of self. For example, even now, through talking to you, I'm kind of anticipating, and the self is a process. It's something that's continual.
Absolutely.
So, in a way, you are somehow shaping my sense of self, my thoughts, and the kind of language I'm going to use and what I'm going to say. So we are essentially relational, and our conversations and our dialogues with others matter and are essential in defining the self.
That's such a central point, isn't it, with so many applications. And in a sense, when you use examples like that of interpersonal communication, so obvious really when you stop to reflect to it.
Yeah.
Because, if you think about maybe 10 conversations you had with 10 people. And inevitably they will have felt different, isn't it? You feel like a different version of yourself, isn't it, in those moments? Sometimes it flows easily. Other times, even saying one word, isn't it, feels difficult.
That's the beauty.
But you're still you in inverted commas, so you're bringing the same thing to the table.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, that's I think the beauty of, coming at the self as more of a dynamic, continual, constantly in flux perspective, rather than, oh, that's John, and I'll put you in a box and I'll define you in a certain way.
Yes, exactly.
So this kind of dynamical relational perspective allows you to be different in different contexts, in different environments. And certainly the kind of conversations we are having, the kind of conversation I'm having with you in this context, in this environment, with a certain kind of, unstated assumptions as to how, podcasts are supposed to take.
Exactly, yeah.
It's different if I go off, say, with my friends on a night out, or if I go for a family reunion, I will essentially behave differently. I'll have different things to say. There will be different norms to follow. So that kind of dynamical self allows you to see the self as contextual and relational and dependent on others and contexts.
And that notion of, how we come to view self to begin with, and as you say, the kind of René Descartes Western, for want of better expressions, really way of summing what that means, of looking at that. That's interesting, isn't it? Because to such a degree, I think many of us have inherited that rather than chosen it at any point. And I'm just thinking there of your solitary confinement example, because these types of things, wherever they've come from originally, whoever designed them, wherever they came from, it certainly isn't the warden coming in on Tuesday morning who's designing that process, isn't it? We kind of inherit these things, and we work within the patterns that we have. And sometimes, of course, the people who do design them are removed from the actual implementation of them. So there seems to be something similar going on with selfhood generally, isn't it? We just ended up with this thing.
And unsurprisingly, we still have those assumptions. We have still those inherited assumptions. So implicit, we are not even aware of them. If you look at most of traditional scientific psychology, the way it approaches the self is as if it is very individualistic, very self-contained. If, for example, if you look at examples of experiments on memory, people are often taken out of their social context, which is essential, and they are brought into labs and given a list of words or numbers to regurgitate and then to remember those words which may not have any meaning at all. So you see those kind of Cartesian unstated assumptions still
context being removed.
It's still infiltrating a lot of our disciplines that are in the human sciences anyway.
So the concern there presumably is the output of that type of research is likely to not be really what we want it to be, because it's not capturing the full phenomena.
It might reveal something about how the brain works in terms of remembering, but it's not going to give you the full picture. Sure. Because it's just, the white room is not your natural environment.
Yes. And what are the implications of that academically? Because there seem to be at least a couple of things that are somewhat at tension there. Because we've said, okay, something's relational, the context matters. We want to bring all this into the mix in order to gather good data that we can use for something useful. So that's one point, and that sounds fair. The other thing, though, I suppose, is our tendency to want to be reductive in science. And of course, there is a need, the notion of dependent and independent variables, to kind of break things down to some degree, because of course, if we literally go very zen about it and we say, well, there's kind of just one thing going on in some sense.
Yes.
It gets pretty tricky to do science.
Yes.
How do you look at that relationship in practice?
I obviously don't have a clear answer for that, but I think that is an irremovable tension, which reminds me of Geert's cultural interpretations passage, where he zooms into a certain culture and records, does ethnographic records of very detailed descriptions, and it gives you the best insight, the best description of knowing how that certain culture works and how those certain groups work, in what context, under what assumptions, and it gives you the full history. But this is where the irremovable tension comes from. Those descriptions, those details might just remain there. You may not find a general pattern in order to say, oh, this is culture, or this is how this society works. So it's a balance that you have to somehow find, to choose between, going deep, providing a brilliant description and explanation on the one hand, but also trying to find generalizable patterns and to kind of come up with a science of, say, the self or culture.
I'm sure if we go back even a few years ago in science, the word science and self in the same sentence would never have been uttered, isn't it? So I hope that's some form of progress. I think, though, just even a consciousness of, isn't it, what we're talking about, the sort of tension between it goes so far by itself.
It does.
It's sort of an inbuilt humility, but not a disabling one. One that just lets us be a bit cautious in doing what we're doing, and kind of add a few disclaimers along the way. And also it points back to the multidisciplinary nature of it, isn't it? Because we need each other, quite simply, isn't it, in this sense, to have an overview.
The more you focus on, specific person's experience or history or culture, the more difficult it is to kind of zoom out. To come up with some sort of science to generalize, about the nature of. I think not only anthropology, also phenomenology to a certain extent has this tension of this problem where phenomenology focuses on the lived experience, on the body, then trying to bring it to another level to a generalizable science.
It seems to be a bit of a golden era potentially for people who were in fields that might have been looked at as being a bit peculiar at certain points in the past, and again, to be fair, sometimes they were, but to no fault of their own. They just needed, I suppose, a scientific format that actually embraced them rather than dismissed them in some way. And there's humility on both sides. We're in a pretty good place. It would be terrible to have, I suppose, all the structure but none of the content, or all of the content, but we can't actually appreciate the content because of a lack of structure. And there seem to be some people, like you talked about Eastern approaches, for example. And there's so many, incredibly well-developed schools of philosophy, but no, it's not that they haven't written a huge amount, and it's not that they don't have, certainly forms of science as part of their function too. They certainly do. But because many of the ways in which they manifest or exist today are in a very applied format, unfortunately, they seem to be excluded at certain points in the past from kind of mainstream study, certainly in the Western format, as you talked about. And then again, the reverse. There might be some very good research questions even at points in empirical science, but it's not looking at as richly as it could as some of the good stuff that's really going on in those types of fields. What's that been like for you? Because you've talked about what is it, Ubuntu perspective, you've talked about Eastern approaches, you've talked about, then of course, Western psychology typically. What's happening in kind of the coming together of some of these things that you've seen in your journey?
What I like about, I have to admit, I'm not an expert in the Eastern perspectives. I know a little bit about Ubuntu, but what they have in common is this shared emphasis for otherness. It's through if you look through the perspectives of Ubuntu and some Eastern philosophy, I'm sure you would know more than I would.
And I certainly don't know as much as I could. Let's put it that way. But yeah,
even some Russian intellectuals like Bakhtin and Vygotsky.
Yeah.
So having some sort of knowledge, bits and pieces from these different perspectives, then the Western approach kind of stands on its own as the outlier rather than the norm.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the way it emphasizes, individualism and self sustaining. So those different perspectives kind of
they embrace that relational type approach that you're talking about.
Dialogical.
And the Ubuntu, I don't know, I can't speak for my listeners, but certainly for me, it'd be something I'd be less familiar with than a number of Eastern approaches, which, I suppose a lot of us think we know, but probably don't know in terms of their depth anyway.
Yeah.
But what has been your experience of Ubuntu philosophy? How would you emphasize some of the core points within it?
Ubuntu is huge, and I can't speak for all of it, and I only... I'm familiar with the aspect of Ubuntu that I see relevant to my research. Which is the way the self is kind of approached. So it's at the core of it is, instead of I think therefore I am, you have I know I am because we are.
Okay.
So you come to know yourself through others, and others are essential in order for you to develop your sense of self. And one stark difference between a Western approach and the Ubuntu, for example, would be you have individual rights for the infant from the time the infant is born. Even before it's born, you have these abortion debates. But for the Ubuntu philosophy, for the Ubuntu approach, the self is not something that's granted, through conception or at birth.
Right.
It's something you gradually develop, and something you gradually work. And
that intuitively makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because if you think, the reason I can kind of relate to that is because in my applied therapeutic work, working with people, the issue of self-concept is, typically the psychological construct that would be used to talk about self in that sense. And self-concept, of course, can be problematic because we mightn't quite have the one we want. The kind of simple way I usually equate it is, it's a bit like the difference between... the buildings, the warehouses, the staff of a company, and its brand.
Yes.
So the brand is so powerful. If you got a call from the lawyers from Coca-Cola who said, listen, we're going to give it to you, but you can only have one. You can have all of those assets or you can have the brand.
Okay.
You'd want the brand really any day of the week. That'd be where the value is. The other things can be replaced, but the brand, would be the value. And it's funny because you wouldn't really get anything in return. And if all of the people left Earth and went to another planet, suddenly the brand would be worthless.
Exactly.
It's this weird distributed thing that we share in some respects.
Yes.
So there seems to be something similar going on with a self-concept. It's a sort of personal brand. And like you said, that the baby doesn't think it's a good baby. Doesn't think it's a bad baby. It doesn't even think it's a baby.
Exactly.
Isn't it? It just is in some sense.
And without others to nourish it and to, help it develop its sense of self, it just wouldn't. It probably would, but it would be a very different story. And
if it gets raised by wolves or something, then it's a very different story, isn't it?
You have that story of the Avon boy.
That's right.
France, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, So yes, others are central, and even in Ethiopia, in a tribe in the south, you have this ceremony for boys and girls. It's different, of course. In order to mark, your sense of self, you would have for a boy. I think it's at the age of 16 or something like that. So the villagers would line up, I think about 4 or 5 oxen. Yeah. And the boy would have to jump through all those in order to show he is now, I see. He can be a man in his...
Very interesting, yeah. And that's actually something I've heard some theorists talk about quite a while back, but I thought it was an interesting point. They were commenting that a lot of, and I'm no expert on this, but they were saying a lot of cultures, both African cultures, Eastern cultures, they were talking about a lot of, I suppose, quite well-established societies. In other words, they've been around a long time, longer than, some of the New World. Yeah. Tend to have some form of rite of passage in that sense, some kind of marking of adulthood. Yeah. And the comment was made was that we seem to, broadly in the West, lack something like that. Now, it's not quite true, because we do have certain things like that, but they seem to be a little bit different. They seem to be more celebrations rather than, kind of a rite of a passage in that sense, which is very formalized. But some of the theorizing around it is that that's kind of a symbolic point to be able to take ownership in that sense, which is sort of psychologically and developmentally useful in some way. Have you met that at all in either your personal experience or your research?
Say that again.
Yeah, it's like this sort of continuity where we just sort of are born and we grow up and we end up as an adult and we go, what happened? Versus actually having some point in time where we kind of symbolically mark it and go, all right, now. And there's a chance to begin a new chapter in some sense.
Exactly.
Does that have value, do you think?
Yeah. Personally, yes, it's something I think about, and I do sometimes wake up and go, oh, shit, this is my life, and this is me, and
exactly.
How did I end up here, and... yeah, where is this going?
Because we inherit so much, isn't it? So, because, and some people make the point that actually having a ceremony where you literally go, all right, now that bit, because there's a difference, isn't it? Because we, as a sense, when you talk about that baby, we by definition, as part of this relational aspect, we have to do what we're told as a child to some extent. We have to kind of take a lot on board, I suppose. But then at a certain point, we're expected to do the opposite. Exactly. Isn't it? We're expected to have autonomy in that way. And in a sense, that can be the opposite of what we were trained to do in some respect. Exactly. So we have to, and there's an important distinction here, of course, between blame and responsibility. Yeah. But there's a sort of an ownership, isn't it, that needs to come at a certain point. And I think it's not often clear where that happens, I suppose, isn't it? It's fuzzy.
Yeah, and I have this sense of feeling that it kind of differs if you say compare the Western perspective as opposed to with the Ubuntu. With the Ubuntu, because so much of life is, communal, and Ubuntu is actually more than just a philosophy. It's also a way of life. Yeah. It also incorporates politics and religion, everything. It's a way of life. It's there is less of a blame on the individual person. Even children, when they are being brought up, are seen as a responsibility of the community, not just the mother and father. If you see a child doing something on the road, you have, as an adult, a responsibility to encourage or to discipline if that child is not, if that child is doing something that they aren't supposed to be. So there is more of a shared responsibility rather than, say, what you see here in the West, where people are more, in a way, self-sustained, and they live, compared to the Ubuntu approach anyway, a more individualistic kind of life, where privacy is very central, where you don't want others interfering with your affairs or
Yeah,
your
exactly.
business.
I'm thinking about how within individual cultures, because we can obviously generalize Eastern and Western, but obviously there's mixes of shades of grey in different regions, in different communities and traditions. But for want of a better term, they are very useful because they do seem to point to a big difference between a kind of an individualistic or a more relational or collective or whatever term we want to use type approach. But I'm thinking about like a country like Ireland where you have a kind of a colliding of some of those worldviews as well, don't you? Because for somebody, who's of an older generation in Ireland who grew up in a very rural area, that more community, local, village lifestyle, everybody being in everybody's business, maybe in a good way, maybe not, but that was, I suppose, something that was taken for granted. You certainly would take responsibility for what you saw somebody else do, a kid, etc. But we don't just have that in our culture. We then have the other thing you're talking about, which is this very segmented, mind your own business kind of a thing. And it's interesting how you see the meeting of that and the friction between it. We've got these different subcultures colliding sometimes.
That tension again between tradition and progress. So one of the issues I have with, the Ubuntu approach is it's very traditional, which means, it's very male dominated.
Right.
There are certain roles for, elders, for males and for females.
Yeah.
So even though I love the communal, the tradition, the relational aspect of it, some aspect of it, it just clashes with my own personal views. Say when it comes to, I can see myself as a radical feminist, so I like to think there shouldn't be roles specific for women or men. I like to think, gender or sex, something that's fluid that you can just work your way across without any, traditions preventing you.
Sure.
So there is that tension again. So
it's interesting how that itself is sort of relationally originated in that, some strong patriarchy in a society essentially is the ultimate, source for feminism, isn't it?
Yes.
Because again, it's that tension. We the experience of one thing makes us reflect, isn't it? And then realize the other thing.
Exactly.
In a sense, the cure for a disease is invented because of the disease. That's the biggest source or motivator, isn't it? To bring it together.
Yes.
So all the problems tend to be important drivers in it. How can we have the best of both, I suppose?
I think the best thing is what I'm doing at the moment is just being aware of it and just moving fluidly between the different roles rather than saying I'm a traditionalist or I'm a progressive or I'm a radical feminist. It's because, we are dynamical, relational, systems that we can, depending on, what's being discussed or what the central issue is, as long as you are aware that there is different perspectives, there is different tensions, I think you are in a better position to kind of place yourself at the best position then. So awareness again of the different perspectives and just being comfortable knowing that sometimes, well, most of the time, you just can't have the best of both worlds and just, adjust yourself depending on...
It's a very, very important point, and it brings in that point of kind of personal ownership, I suppose, as well, of what you're doing, and that point of kind of inheriting belief systems. And, we got to be quite careful, don't we, in doing that and just taking these structures that are kind of handed to us from people before us. And we got to be careful, even if we knew for certain that they absolutely meant their best.
Exactly, yes.
Because, this is iterative, isn't it? We're developing ideas, we're learning, and we're growing.
Exactly.
So we don't want to just accept something because it was done. We don't want to just reject it, of course, because it was done either. But we want to be able to, build on that knowledge and that experience in some way. So that, what some people might see as picking and choosing, it is that, but in a positive way, because after all, if we don't pick or choose, that is already a form of picking and choosing in a sense, because the structures, the particular culture we inherit.
Yes, exactly. And
came from somewhere.
I'm kind of speaking from personal experience. I know it's better to be kind of, consistent in your decision making, in your, ethics and morals and all that. But sometimes, for example, I can never have, a conversation about religion with my mother.
Okay, yeah.
That's just
that's
not
relational strategies. Yeah. You have to be context sensitive. Yeah.
So when it comes to, a conversation with my mom that concerns religion, I'm just gonna drop my strong, atheist stand and just, pray when she brings the food out and go along with her way. Because it's not gonna, bring any productive discussions. We are just not gonna meet halfway.
Yes, I see. Yeah.
A lot of, politics now, especially with, the far right and the far left.
Yeah.
They are just so, far apart. It seems impossible to see the middle way.
Yeah.
So,
right, exactly. Very, very true. But that's a really nice point because, you could go either way, couldn't you? You could say, okay, well, I'm going to adopt a stance. This is a position I have, and that could lead to exclusion. So, for example, if somebody has an atheistic perspective of the world, that could naturally lead to a rejection of religious practice in some way.
Yeah.
Or it could go exactly the opposite.
Yes.
And they could therefore feel comfortable going to many churches, mosques, prayer centers, spiritual traditions, etc. And kind of the example is coming forward of like of an anthropologist.
Yeah.
You read anthropological writings sometimes, and this person has a very different background, but they're living in some tribe, they're participating in some culture, and it certainly may not be what matches their particular convictions.
Yes.
But they're there with a curiosity and a fascination.
And
when
with
the person
open mind.
exactly, and when the person's talking about some strange phenomena, they're not necessarily believing it to be the case, but they have an interest and an openness, as you say, to it. There seems to be room for that kind of mode of inquiry.
Yes, in that context, in that example, you just suspend your own belief and you approach it with open mind. That way you learn and understand so much about that, unfamiliar territory, let's say. But when it comes to, having very strongly different perspectives, I try to give the other the benefit of the doubt, and I tried to engage in a more, positive way that would somehow end up me changing my mind, or the other person, meeting me halfway or something like that. But sometimes when that's not there, you just have to leave it and say
you do. You have to pick your battles. That's another one of those tensions, isn't it? Because the mode of being the anthropologist, and we can all do that in a day-to-day sense. We can kind of go into this mode of inquiry where we have a curiosity about what's happening without validating it or fighting it in that moment, but just sort of an inquiry. The problem, I suppose, with that, though, is there's another aspect of ourselves who kind of feels the need to stand up for what we believe, and not even for our own purposes.
Exactly.
It could come at a cost to us, actually, in that moment, but that sense of responsibility, albeit socially.
Yes.
So it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because if you were the anthropologist visiting a different culture, where is the line, isn't it, where you, on one hand, you just observe things passively, but there probably is a point. If somebody, you're in some ancient South American civilization that's about to sacrifice a child or something, where you go, okay, I'm not an anthropologist anymore, I'm going to get involved in this. It's an interesting one, isn't it, because that can happen.
Well, I'm not an anthropologist by training.
And I mean that casually, of course, just as a...
But anthropology doesn't, has a really dark history, of course, all these Western male anthropologists going and, even, raping the local women and even just injecting their own ideology and treating others as primitives, as undeveloped. But leaving all that history aside, you have brilliant anthropologists such as Richard Geertz, also the Australian Michael Jackson, whom I just discovered recently. So for them, for Geertz anyway, there is no just, you know, standing back and kind of observing and taking notes. For him, he really immersed himself.
Okay.
And he did what the locals did, and that way he seemed also to have got a really helpful insight.
Very nice
into
point.
Understanding.
Because that highlights the embodiment you were talking about earlier as well. Because you know, you can imagine an anthropologist standing writing about the dance that's happening in front of them versus dancing.
Exactly,
Which
is
a whole different experience.
Different. Yes.
Yeah. That participation really matters.
Participation and actually just the action, doing it.
Yeah. And the other, I think, a kind of a consequence of relational thinking that sometimes isn't appreciated is that it's not that, you know, if we take relational thinking to be possible at all, it's not that it's a good idea, it's that it's always happening. Isn't it? There's a difference there. It's not that we're saying, look, as the anthropologist, or it could be anyone else, you should participate. It's more saying, no, you are already participating.
Yes.
Your presence there is it's going to have an observer effect at least.
Of course.
If you go to study anything, that is going to impact it in some way.
Yeah, people are, you know, it's going to be something different when, you know, a different person that looks different to them, that acts different, that may not have a clue what's going on. You know, when that person is present, it's gonna have an effect. So
we kind of just need to own that in some sense, isn't it? And make decisions. And I suppose there aren't any a priori right ways to approach it, because, you know, we can certainly imagine a situation where experimentally somebody will want to get less involved and kind of stand back, but they're not making the assumption that they're not there, because they are there. They're just including that as a variable in their equations in that sense.
Just making, you know, stating it and then, you know, being aware of it, that makes the difference. And even
in just regular medical research, in terms of double-blind experiments, which you know are really the gold standard people look for, that is already, you know, taken into account to some extent, isn't it? The idea is that, you know, the person obviously doesn't know what they're being given if it's a placebo trial with an active medication, but the person administering it doesn't know either, and we're kind of looking at that and trying to take that into account. So it's having that same kind of mindfulness, isn't it, in the way we look at things. What is dialogical thinking? And Mikhail Bakhtin, we've talked about as well, as somebody you've referenced before. For somebody who doesn't know what dialogical thinking is, how would you in some way introduce it and relate it to what we've just been talking about?
Okay. Dialogical thinking is, well, most of the original work comes from Mikhail Bakhtin. But since then, a lot of people have developed it, and especially Berliner. He's written a brilliant book. So a lot of my understanding of dialogism comes from, you know, a mixture of Bakhtin and Berliner. And as Berliner states in his book, dialogism or dialogical thinking is just not one school of thinking. There are different, you know, strands or different routes you can take. Which
seems appropriate, doesn't it, given the subject matter?
Yes, But at the center of it is, I suppose you could say, is emphasizing the idea that we are essentially dialogical beings. So when you think about epistemology, for example, our knowledge of a certain thing, you know, should incorporate the dialogical element of our being.
Yes.
And it's emphasizing the role of the other, which is, a lot of it is in line with Ubuntu philosophy.
Yeah, because it sounds like that.
Yeah.
A little bit more familiar with dialogical approaches than Ubuntu approaches, but from what you said, it sounded like that. And what distinctions or what emphasis is there in dialogical thinking in anything other than just saying being relational? Because it seems we could say that. Have we got the job done then, or have you found that approach takes a particular perspective or has certain views of the implications of that?
The implications is it's a lot of work is in language studies and linguistics, and even though I'm very interdisciplinary, language linguistics is not something I really have a good grasp on. Or
it's a big area, isn't it? There's a lot to be said about it.
Yeah. So it's in terms of, you know, emphasizing the way language is understood. So also a lot of dialogism works against this Western kind of, you know, individualistic kind of assumptions. So for Perlinel, for example, language is something that's dynamical. Again, as I was saying earlier, even when we are communicating, you know, your response depends on the words I'm saying, and then what you are saying kind of informs, you know, my next sentence. Right. So it's, for him, it's something that's, you know, contextual, that's, you know, constantly changing, and
it's co-constructed in that way.
Exactly. Rather than, you know, the Chomskyan approach of, you know, words having a certain meaning and being, you know, that way. More
fixed. A bit of a Wittgenstein seems to come in as well to this, doesn't it? Often. Particularly in terms of the language aspect of it.
Exactly.
What are the implications of this, do you think, in education, in therapy, and in other fields? You know, but they're two very core fields that are very much about learning, I suppose. How do you see the implication? If somebody takes relational, dialogical thinking seriously, what might they practically do differently on a Monday morning?
Yeah, actually, in education, a lot of Vygotsky is also can be described as, you know, the pioneer of dialogical thinking.
Yes.
You probably know more.
Big Vygotsky fan,
yes. So a lot of his theorizing and his thinking has been translated into, you know, classrooms and teacher-student relations. So it has had an effect, and it continues to have an effect. So
it's interesting how that's happened, because it is true that very early on when you study psychology, you'll meet Vygotsky, and that's good. You know, that being said, though, the particularly relational aspect doesn't seem to be quite emphasized to the degree it is in certainly branches of cognitive science, the focus on relational thinking. It still kind of comes across to me anyway a bit more like maybe a strong form of social psychology, isn't it, as opposed to that real relational depth to it. And to be fair, it can probably be used successfully either way to some extent. But of course, it seems like we want to go a bit further with some of those relational principles.
I suppose it's that shift in thinking, especially, say, for example, in the educational setting. That shift in thinking and looking at the child as something that you kind of scaffold, that you provide the necessary conditions for the child to learn.
Very good,
rather than, say, take the other position where, you know, the child is seen as, you know, little scientist, or you know, something that can produce or solve problems or construct this or that by herself.
Yes, and this ties in beautifully then to themes of experiential learning, isn't it? Because it is this idea of doing rather than just knowing in that sense. That brings in the embodiment as well.
Exactly.
I've always, you know, obviously there's different educational systems around the world vary a bit, but I've always kind of loved the kind of play school. I mean, Marie Montessori is another example of this. It would be in line with some of those thinkers. But we seem to unfortunately lose that at a certain point along the way, isn't it? If anything, I found you get it more actually in third level again. I mean, not always by any means, but, you know, you can do just this sense of interaction and just even the subject matter. I mean, certainly here in my research in UCD, using virtual reality, we're doing applied things where, you know, there's a lot going on in that sense, which is very exciting. It seems like we'd like to bring a lot of that interaction back again to education.
Interdisciplinarity and just like, you know, just like cognitive science, the beauty of, you know, the dialogical approach is it's very interdisciplinary. you can look at so many things from a dialogical perspective.
Yeah.
Berliner even goes as far as to see the brain as dialogical, even though some people would say it's more interactional rather than dialogical. But you know, you have language, decision making,
yeah,
brain studies.
It's a lot of stuff going on, and it's, you know, it's for people like us, I suppose, to try and pick at these things and understand the details of them. But the interesting thing about good learning is that it really just happens so naturally in the right context.
Yes,
you know, and
context matters.
you can get free teachers. You know, if you're teaching geography, you can get a mountain to do a lot of the work for you if you can just get access to it, isn't it, in some way, which is kind of exciting. So the other big theme or topic area, which I think certainly for me ties in nicely to this that you've been talking about, that is, I don't know how we would describe it, but some of the roles of automation, of technology, and the social consequences, I suppose, of technology.
Yeah.
What are you looking at in that area at the moment, or what are some of your interests?
Yeah, that's becoming a big, you know, issue of discussion anyway, within data scientists anyway. So it's, I think for you know, doctors or engineers, you are aware that how your work will influence, you know, the other person or society. So when you, as an engineer, when you build a bridge, you essentially, you know, contemplate the effects of how people will use it, you know, how it's going to affect, you know, the landscape or the lives of others. So the ethical aspect is also incorporated in the design and in the building. But I think for a lot of data science also, it's very new. The work has gone so far, the ethical aspects of it hasn't really caught up, and all these, you know, software engineers, they you know, they develop these beautiful algorithms that can, you know, do so much, but they hardly think about what kind of effects they might have on society.
And just like that, finally we have jobs for philosophers. Finally, isn't it?
I was actually, just the other day, I was playing with this Face app. I don't know if you've seen it.
I haven't, but I've heard somebody talking about it, but I haven't checked it.
Just in the last couple of weeks. So you can download this Face app. You can take a selfie or upload your own already stored pictures, and you can, you know, you can make it to make you older, or to make you, you know, to change your gender and all sorts of things, and to make you more cute or more beautiful. And one of the things that was shocked a lot of, you know, social media anyway, was that this software's idea of, you know, cuter or more beautiful was making the skin more whiter. So a lot of black people, I also tried it on myself. When you ask it to make you more beautiful, it just makes you more white. So it's well,
I hope it doesn't make me whiter. I mean, the average Irish person, that's funny, we're trying to do the opposite, isn't it? To be cute, it's like fake tan all the time, isn't it? So this seems like an inversion.
These are so a lot of people are saying that's the algorithms are just racist.
Yes.
But so what's important is for people who you know, do this, you know, train these neural networks to consider in advance what their idea of beauty is. And how that represents, you know, the general population, not just what they have in mind. So that's where the ethical side of thinking about algorithms and neural networks comes in. And the problem is a lot of these, you know, algorithms are taken as neutral, unbiased, and, you know, objective, whereas people forget if the data you feed them is already biased, and I'm very skeptical that there's data that's free from bias, then your outcome is going to be, based on the data you gave it. So it's going to be biased. So.
And is that what happened in the case of that app?
Yeah.
Where did it, do you know where it got its data from originally? What's the system it uses?
I don't know about the data, but
we put a link to it.
You can put a link on it. Just yesterday, they issued a statement apologizing that the data that they used to train their neural networks is biased. And
I see. So
they
presumably acquired some data and fed it in.
Yes.
So. Which is a dangerous process, all right, because at least if something is self-learning and can correct in some way, you have some chance. But if it's a sort of a limited data set,
exactly,
well, then it kind of gets sealed, isn't it? Whatever errors are there to begin with.
Yeah, it's up to the people who do these things to, when they select their data, to think about what data represents, what.
Yeah, and if they can't, hire a philosopher. There's plenty at your local department looking for jobs, I'm sure.
Yes.
But I mean that quite seriously, and though I joke about hiring philosophers, one of the reasons I got into psychology rather than philosophy, and though I love philosophy, is because I wanted to do something very applied.
Yes.
And my worry was, would I really have the opportunity to do that with a philosophy background? Now, there's plenty of people who are managing to do it, but also plenty of people who aren't, I suppose. And when I see these people, and, I know some of them, and they're so capable and able, it's disappointing, that their skill can't be applied more. And it seems that technology, and we should say modern technology, because of course technology is a part of being human in a sense, but has sped up the pace and the necessity. It's sort of amplified the need for these types of questions to be asked.
Exactly.
So there really is a great role and opportunity now for that.
Also, a lot of, a lot of the consensus among, the data scientists that are aware of these issues anyway, which is not a great many of them, unfortunately, is that interdisciplinary work, in the humanities are really, really needed.
Okay.
Within, a lot of these people who just, spend all their time on, machine learning and thinking about numbers. It's really, they either have to work with people who, because essentially at the end of the day, what they produce interacts with society, but they don't really have a very good idea of, the social sphere and how people within that social sphere operate and how it interacts with individual people in society.
Well, it's a kind of ergonomics, cognitive ergonomics, isn't it? Imagine if you're a very, very skilled chair manufacturer, but you never consider people.
Yes.
Because you may, by all means, have the technical capability to make these things.
Yes.
But the sense in how the person uses it, is it safe? Is it comfortable? Is it suitably adaptive for different types of bodies and different use cases and different circumstances, isn't it? All of this really matters.
Exactly.
Because it creates constraints in how we interact. And, even as we interact now, the chairs are playing as much a part in this conversation as a number of other factors are, where it's kind of mediating, isn't it, how we communicate and how we sit, etc.
Exactly. And it's not considering, how it mediates or how it interacts is people may not be aware of it who are really, focusing on developing their own neural nets or algorithms or whatever. But it's very important because maybe not so much here in Ireland or in Europe. You see a lot of issues, popping out in the States anyway. Cathy O'Neill has written a brilliant book. Maybe you can also stick a reference to it, called Weapons of Mass Destruction.
Okay.
I don't know if you've read it.
I haven't read it, no.
So throughout the book, example by example, she's a mathematician. She's a brilliant mathematician who graduated from Harvard. And she illustrates how, using these algorithms to score people, to make decisions about, say, in the courtrooms, who is more likely to commit crime, or who is a better fit to get a mortgage or a health insurance, using all those algorithms
that really
to use
matter.
those,
Yeah.
they really are creating, you know, a huge inequality.
Right.
And they are very unfair if you are already, you know, a minority, or if you are not earning a lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because at the end, at the center of them, the central objective is to maximize profit, to maximize efficiency, rather than, you know, say, to help prisoners, you know, cope with society.
Yeah.
There is not, she actually mentions, there isn't actually much research on how prisoners, you know, cope on with life after their release.
Isn't it amazing?
Yeah. So the central objective when they are developing those algorithms is to just put people in jail, rather than, you know, the positive, you know, more productive way of, in terms of looking at society in general, more productive way of, you know, how this could benefit society.
And I wonder, will it trickle up in that, you know, as we, a more of a local sense, start to think about how these technologies work, will that hopefully happen on a greater level as well? Because again, there seems to be such a lack of vision. I mean, prison itself is such a good example.
Yes.
Are we trying to just exclude people, you know, for safety? Are we trying to reform? Are we trying to punish?
Yeah.
Isn't it? There's such a confusion. And of course, if you try and do all of them at the same time, from a, you know, a behavioral point of view, it must be just so confusing for the system.
Exactly. And the system, as far as Kati is concerned anyway, is mainly concerned about punishing rather than reforming the prison system.
Yeah.
There is no question about how it's working or how it should improve.
Right.
And a lot of these algorithms, they are, because of, you know, intellectual rights and all that, they are protected.
I see.
So you can't really scrutinize them.
Okay.
Even with that, to begin with, they are like black boxes. People who build them even have difficulty understanding them. And the longer they go on, the longer people kind of lose sight in how they work. So they become just, you know, even more black boxes.
Absolutely. So yeah, because there's a huge issue with self-fulfilling prophecies, isn't there, with this? Because when you know, treat people a certain way, even, you know, some people who to some degree maybe deserve, you know, certain things. The problem is when this gets overdone, or when there's implicit assumptions built in, this leads to a frustration, which leads people to act against, which in turn leads to an attempt to punish. And this just becomes a real self-fulfilling prophecy then.
Exactly. And that's what actually the prison systems over in the United States anyway, that's what they do. They have these hypotheses that say a certain demographics commit more crime. That demographics usually is, you know, Hispanics or blacks.
Yeah.
And they, you know, patrol that area more heavily as opposed to, you know, other rich areas, which commit as much crime, but, you know, more like white collar crimes.
Sure.
But they, you know, if you focus your eye on something, you are going to find something.
Yeah.
So they focus on certain demographics, and they find, when they find something, they use that evidence to fuel their own their own hypothesis. So it kind of, it's like a loop.
It just feeds itself. Exactly.
It feeds
That's
itself.
where the systems theory comes back in again, isn't it? You can see it as such a pattern, isn't it? You can imagine it really. It's so vivid in that way.
Yeah, and they just use that evidence to reinforce their own first, you know, their own justification for focusing on those demographics.
So in keeping with the point of, you know, modern technology just being an extension of technology, we've always, as much as we've had a world that we've interacted with, we've always had some form of technology, I suppose, and the ability to use it in some shape or form. The black boxes, the software that you talked about there, they seem to be something similar in that they've become more externalized and codified as, you know, what we would call algorithms.
Yeah.
But I suppose they've always existed, isn't it? In the past, it would have been in the mind of whatever that is, of the warden as he sits there and makes a decision, or culturally extended in some way. That's what's interesting about this. We seem to be at a time now where we never would have, well, maybe I suppose in maybe religious textbooks or maybe certain guideline documents, but we seem to be in very local cases kind of codifying assumptions, which is interesting.
That's true. But what makes these algorithms more dangerous is even in the case of your example of that warden.
Yeah.
You are aware he's a human being, and you know that humans are, prone to biases.
Yeah.
But in the case of these algorithms, you kind of assume they are neutral because they don't have that human error.
I see. So that is the assumption.
That's where the distraction comes from.
Wow.
That's
and
the
why
problem.
are people assuming that?
Well, they are not humans. They can't make errors. They are mathematical
the absence
models.
of humanity, therefore,
Yeah.
is it's this sort of this strange reification
And
of technology in some way. Yeah.
And they are, Kathy actually provides brilliant examples of, basketball players. They are brilliant. They actually, these, statistics, these algorithms, they are essential in determining whether a certain team wins or not. But the difference between those kind of algorithms and the other ones that are more of a black box is transparency. Whereas the algorithms used in managing a basketball team are constantly fed with new data in order to
exactly
improve.
And they're dynamic, as we said.
And they are transparent. People can see what goes on. What does what. But whereas these other more protected black boxes,
I see,
there is no transparency. Even people who run them themselves don't even have that great knowledge of how they operate.
So we've got this sort of dangerous algorithm in the middle, which isn't the one that's in the mind, in inverted commas, of the person, like the warden, which has the advantage of being seen as just his opinion, hopefully.
Yes.
We don't have the other extreme then, which are these algorithms which are maybe pretty decent, but they're decent because they're transparent and because they're constantly being fed. They're work in progress. They're dynamic in that way. The concern is over this strange kind of algorithm in the middle, which is the black box that you mentioned, which isn't given the doubts that would be applied to human beings. It's seen as being in some way good because it's technology, but the content of it isn't properly scrutinized.
Yeah, it is good. It's super efficient. It does a lot of computing in a very short of time, which has like never before. But with that comes a lot of the values you can't quantify.
And it's tricky. And where did this get lost? Because I remember it as a teenager, certainly, probably as a young teenager, actually. I think I was very young. I might have been as young as 12 or 13 or something. I remember doing a simple IT course, and an IT course back then was it was very theoretical, I suppose. It was really talking about information processing in some way. But just one of the big things, like the internet hadn't really kicked off in a serious way. that I would call it the internet.
Careful, you are showing your age.
I'm not that old. That's the funny thing. It's just happened that quickly. It really isn't even that long ago. But it's just, I suppose, really in the 90s it kicked off, and the thousands. It's amazing, how much has happened so quickly. But the big thing they highlighted from the very beginning in any IT material I encountered was garbage in, garbage out. Garbage in, garbage out. They just emphasized this so much. And they said, look, these systems are essentially, good. They're able to do what they do. But what they do can only be the product of what you give it. What they said is essentially your fault if it doesn't work in a good way.
Yeah. That's why a lot of, consensual anyway. Data scientists are like Cathy O'Neill are pushing towards teaching all these developers and software engineers the ethics and the ethical and the the societal, the humanity side of things.
Got you.
So it's not all we are doing, but
there's opportunity.
As far as we can emphasize. We can, make people aware of the dangers and the problems of, the opaqueness of these things. Then people who develop them are more likely to be aware and to kind of give it a second thought before they develop something like this face app.
Very true. I don't know what you think about this, but I have a hope that because it's just happening so rapidly, that we won't suffer from the kind of change blindness that we suffer from when things change slowly.
Yes.
You know, the way simplicity, the example is if you come every week to visit somebody and you move the table, by a few millimeters each time, you could really have it at the other end of the room and they wouldn't have noticed it moving. But it seems to be there's so much happening. Now, there's a problem with that, of course, because it's hard to keep up with, and that's the point with the ethics I think you're making. But also, hopefully, we're just so strucken by these things that it really prompts us to question them in a way that we mightn't. Is that the case, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure. Cathy O'Neill seems to think if we don't wake up and if we don't teach our data scientists, the humanities side of things, we are in danger of, furthering inequalities.
Well, that's true if they don't have the tools to do that. That's a good point.
So people like her seem to think we really, really need an interdisciplinary approach, and we really need, the social sciences because they are essentially, these products, these developments are essentially interacting and, intersecting with the social sphere. So some knowledge of how society works, and what underlying assumptions there are is essential. So she seems to think if we don't do that, we are in danger of a lot of people being disadvantaged and further marginalized.
It's reminding me of the old distinction in terms of how doctors were chosen for courses, and it could be status, which is a terrible way to choose it, or just because your parents were. That's a classic old Irish traditional tendency. The other possibility was it was based on, cold clinical scientific ability in some respects, which, again, is useful in some respects. But then they started saying, well, what about this thing of bedside manner and, which is a term they have to try and describe that interpersonal part of it and how important that is. Could something similar be true for data scientists, really, that we actually need, these thinking, feeling people, I suppose, at the core of this?
Yeah, definitely. I think not only data science, any field, that essentially involves humans really need to interact with the human sciences.
Right. But that was the old assumption, I suppose, is, but the data science didn't interact with or was mediated in a way that would be okay. And maybe that was true, maybe it wasn't, but it certainly isn't now, is it?
Well, it seems like a lot of, data scientists, the majority of them that's, being trained, don't actually think beyond what they are doing.
Yeah.
That is the problem. They don't see, they don't zoom out and see where it will go and how it will affect others.
Yes, yeah. And I've met both, and I'm encouraged to, hear people who really, take this stuff very seriously. But I've also met people who don't. I've met people who say, look, we could have no possible use for philosophy. The data is going to do what the data is going to do. Reflecting on this is a waste of time. I've literally been told that too. But I've met plenty of people on the other side who are very, I suppose, empathic as well as very technically competent. So it's exciting to see that really exists.
That's true.
I suppose we probably need a bit of both, don't we? Because we need, the tools, I suppose, for people to be able to reflect themselves on what they're doing. But at the same time, we all need somebody outside to some degree to be able to look in as well. We need that reflection.
Exactly. That's what I'm hoping to do here in UCD. I hopefully will bring my interdisciplinary expertise. So that's what I'm hoping to achieve working with the data scientists here.
Well, there is plenty to be done, I'm sure. UCD is a big place, but it's so important. It's a great need.
It is, and as you are aware, here in the School of Computer Science and in the Insight Center for Data Analytics, there is a lot of progress, a lot of work being done, but not so much in terms of looking at the ethical side of the work. So
absolutely. Well, a great opportunity. The dialogical approaches that we were talking about, we've talked more about kind of the relationship between people and other people and that kind of co-creation. When you bring the technology into that then and think more about people interfacing directly, not so much the algorithms in the background, another part of it that maybe somebody uses in an office somewhere, but people and technology in a day-to-day sense. What are you noticing in that at the moment?
I don't actually, I don't know.
The smartphones are just such a kind of a ubiquitous example, isn't it, of the degree to which these things, our sense of self, I suppose, is
yeah.
just dissolved in that sense.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and I think if David Chalmers in his work talking about Otto and the Notebook, and you know, of course, the Notebook is long gone in a sense. It's the smartphone now, and the degree of that paper couldn't be more true.
And the boundaries are definitely blurring more and more and more between, you know, your real actual live self and your virtual presence. Because speaking from personal experience, I, like many other people, I presume, spend a lot of time, you know, on Twitter or other mediums, and you are in a sense creating, you know, a sense of self, and sometimes the boundaries are so blurred, you even get confused between what happened for real and what took place over on Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
It is, and it's a sort of a confusing time. So in whether it's dialogical principles or whether it's Ubuntu or whether it's any of what you've encountered, how do you think some of those principles might inform how we relate directly with technology moving forward?
Again, I'm going to, because I don't know much about this, I'm going to speak from personal experience.
Please,
and I think it's undeniable that our presence in the virtual world essentially influences, you know, and kind of directs and shapes our sense of who we are. A lot of what I learn, you know, comes from interacting with other scientists and philosophers, say on Twitter, and it just becomes part of, you know, my sphere of knowledge.
Yes,
and it kind of builds up, and
it's amazing because I, as I think I've said to you before, I consider you a Twitter guru in that sense, and that you seem to know what the hell you're doing, basically, because I certainly don't. And I'm not technologically incompetent by any means. I use a lot of technology, but it's a fascinating, again, extended self, I suppose, because, you know, the ideas, what I'm terrible at is just knowing how to sort all this information. That's my biggest problem, and I think that's a common problem I think people describe, isn't it?
And there is, you know, a negative side and a positive side.
I see
like
that.
Everything. So the negative side is you just spend way too much time on Twitter and you feel unproductive. It's but the positive side is also I think my interactions with others, it's real live interactions, really you know, help me develop, you know, my research, my own knowledge, my awareness of, you know, the general political environment, and they are essential.
Your reach is so great. It's amazing. You know, I'll see a tweet of yours, I'll follow an article or something. It's amazing the degree to which you can impact people that you're not directly meeting in the day-to-day sense. It's truly amazing.
That's the brilliant thing about Twitter. You can directly interact with someone who has written some article that you loved, and you can get their personal, real life feedback and comment. That's the great thing about it.
And it's unusual because in some ways it's deeper than sometimes face-to-face interaction will be, because the depth you can go to quite quickly, because there's a sort of a consent that we're all talking about this topic that we can kind of do instantly. Whereas often you'll meet somebody, you might say, how's the weather? Isn't it? It's strange about, it may seem less personal, but it can be more sometimes.
You kind of cut the, it's, but also it's, you have some sort of, you know, agency in terms of choosing who you want to follow, who you want to hear from, you know, what kind of information you want to get. So to some extent, you know, it's up to you to kind of shape your
absolutely
your input, the information you get, as opposed to, say, Facebook, where you just
Yeah, that's the problem I have, I think,
become
is shaping that.
friends
Yeah, yeah, exactly. A
Yeah.
lot of decisions.
Yeah, yeah.
Have you been keeping up much on the developments in virtual reality or mixed reality? Do you have any views on that from your background or research?
I'm afraid not very much. A lot of what I know comes from your research.
Okay,
So
yeah. Sure.
It's
interesting because, again, it just seems to be drawing us more into it.
Yes,
And
yeah.
I suppose mixed reality is a big thing that's happening, whereby, you know, rather than being on the smartphone, now it may be superimposed in the environment in front of us. Those tweets, you know, that might be coming up at the corner of our eye rather than in the phone in our pocket.
Exactly.
So, again, it's becoming more ergonomic, I suppose, which could be good or bad in that sense.
Yeah.
We may reach a time soon where we're never looking at our phone ever again because we don't have a phone, so to speak. So that's interesting, isn't it? Because on one hand, the problem is we're always looking at our phone in a sense because of that change, because it's potentially there, it's augmented in our reality.
Why do you think we may not have our phone at some stage?
Think about it, the phone is a very kind of temporary thing, isn't it, in our history, because we didn't have them quite, you know, only recently we had mobile phones anyway, and they're quickly kind of trying to get rid of them as they bring in various forms of glasses or even just kind of adaptive screens and things like that in the environment. Again, the ergonomics of interacting through this thing, they became better when they became touchscreen. But again, there's this sort of movement against glass rectangles, where people want to get rid of screens. And one of the classic examples is if you're driving, you know, not having to look down to see your speed, but it's up in front of you, projected on the windscreen, things like that. So what would it mean for you if your Twitter wasn't on your phone or on your laptop, but if it was kind of part of your life floating around you?
I am not as immersed in the mixed reality, literature as you are, but for me, it's really difficult to the idea of just having no phone and having that screen or those glasses replace the phone. Well, it takes a while to get used to something new. So to me, that would be something radical.
With the pace things are going at, we can probably ask you in about 6 months, I think. You know, it wouldn't surprise me with the way it is going.
Probably, yeah.
So to draw some of these great ideas we've been exploring together, I wanted to ask you if you had some advice for people who have similar interests in this area, who want to at most dedicate their life to it, at least jump into it and explore these kinds of ideas. As a kind of a multidisciplinarian, somebody who has that kind of background and has been on the journey you've been on, what kind of advice would you give for somebody who also is a bit multidisciplinary and wants to pursue their interests?
I think interdisciplinary is the way forward. Whatever topics you are looking at, whether it is, ethics in data science or, trying to understand human behavior or the brain, it's just approaching it from one perspective, from one discipline is just not enough. You have to really be multidisciplinary, and you have to, bring in insights from as many perspectives as possible in order to move forward, in order to make some contributions.
So should people feel confident to just jump in and not worry about the boundaries too much?
The boundaries are blurring, I think. And I think a lot of universities are, introducing a lot of interdisciplinary courses and interdisciplinary approaches. And I think that's the future. This may be a similar question or a similar answer, but as you kind of zoom out and give yourself a satellite perspective on your life, the journey you've been on, if you think about maybe yourself when you were way younger and then you think about where you are now, any kind of key insights stand out for you? Anything you're much clearer on now than you would have been then? Anything that's a kind of a key point or takeaway for you? This might sound like a bit of a paradox. The more, I'm aware of so many different perspectives and different disciplines, the more I am aware that the problem I'm trying to come at is much more ambiguous and problematic than I initially thought, because I would have come from, a very simplistic approach, assuming this is the problem. the solution is gonna go this way at least.
Okay, yeah.
So the more you are aware of the different perspectives, the more you are aware of the nuances, and yeah, it's brilliant, because if you want to have a very, you know, gestalt kind of whole approach, you really have to consider all perspectives and all sides in order to come up with a true solution.
Wonderful. What a great point. If people want to find out a bit more about your work and to keep in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
I have a blog.
And we'll add some links.
Yeah, and I'm also on Twitter.
Wonderful. So follow you on Twitter, definitely. It's well worth it. You won't be disappointed in terms of content. Listen, Abeba, it's been fabulous having you on the podcast, and chat again soon. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been brilliant. Thank you.